Whether you like it or not, it comes back to this equation of how much time is required, what is the cost of that time, how does that compare to what you sell? And the only way to really figure that out at precise levels within the organization, like in terms of clients, projects, services, is to have an understanding of how much time goes into those things. So that's why it's important. No matter how you bill, your cost basis is always tied to time, primarily in this business model. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Joining me again today is the lovely Kristen Kelly. Kristen, thank you for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
We're talking about everybody's favorite thing today, time tracking, the most controversial, most misunderstood, most hated, in some cases loved thing with agencies. So why don't you tee us up for today? Why time tracking? Why are we talking about this? And what are we hoping to accomplish in our conversation today?
Yeah. So you're rightly identifying that this is this ongoing debate and discussion. We here at Parakeeto see a lot of agencies time tracking and struggling, or just maybe not doing it at all because maybe they don't think it's worth it. There's a perceived investment there, a perceived pain. Really, we're here today to help. So there are ways to make this suck less and actually, be useful. So to set expectations, today's episode is not here to get into, the how-tos or the granular details, even though that's where a lot of agencies start. We're not here to debate the merit of tools like Harvest, ClickUp, EverHour. Really, those are only as good as the systems that are around them. So today's episode I'm going to dig into why time tracking is not just relevant, but critical, and how it can make your business more efficient and profitable. Yeah. All right. So let's dig in. Marcel, there's lots of discussion being had and content circulating, I feel. All these hot takes that timesheets are irrelevant, and the reasoning varies, but I think we could just cut to the core here. Like, why does time tracking matter?
So, maybe I'll take a quick step back and just talk about the arguments against timesheets. There are a couple of common threads in the majority of the literature, the majority of the stances that people take against timesheets. And the most common one from, I'll call it the traditional agency world, is coupling it to time and materials billing. So there's this conflation that because the industry is moving away from exclusively billing on time and materials, that therefore there is no purpose for time tracking, because historically that's been seen primarily as a way to meet that requirement, to track the time so that it can be billed. So that's like one common misconception. The other comes, I think, a lot more from like the freelance world, where it's the idea that we are going to intentionally place the arbitrary constraint of capacity on the business. So this business must be constrained to whatever I am able to do as one person, or whatever I am able to do as like a very small team. Therefore, the only way for me to increase my revenue and profitability beyond a certain threshold is to shift my pricing model to one of value. And again, therefore, because it's a conflating billing models and time tracking as being sort of inherently related to one another. And then the last argument against time tracking data is that it's, people tend to have trouble with compliance, and people tend to have trouble with accuracy. And because it's not perfect all the time, then it's completely pointless. That there's no gray area between it being somewhat accurate, somewhat helpful, and being completely useful and perfect all the time. So those are sort of the two main arguments against it. And most people that have experienced time tracking, I would say, have experienced it in an environment where it was not being used in the way that it should be used in old school firms, where it was used just for billing the client, or it was used to hold people to crazy utilization targets, or it was used to penalize people for going over budget on projects. And none of those are really the way that time tracking should be used. And so I think for all of these reasons, both cultural and strategic, people think, oh, this is bad. And a lot of these symptoms that I've felt of the negative application of time tracking are inherently linked to time tracking itself. They're inherent byproducts of that. And so hopefully we can demystify some of that. Now I'll answer the question that you asked me, which is why is it important? And the simple answer is we're in the business. If you run a service-based business, and agencies are service-based business, consulting firms are service-based businesses, the way that we define a service-based business is that we are providing a service which requires human capital or human labor or time, right? Our business model is predicated on purchasing time from a human being, often at a fixed rate in exchange for a salary. So 2,080 hours of your time, and then monetizing a certain amount of that capacity that we've paid for by reselling it to clients, ideally at a decent markup. And if we do that well, all three of the people in that engagement win. The person that has a job, which they're happy with, they get paid for their time, they have stable income. That's great. The client gets problem solved that they want at a value that's tenable to them, and the business hopefully makes a profit. That's the goal. And so the issue with that is we don't know how much it costs us to do anything unless we know where that time is being invested. And time tracking, which I define as the model of where time is being invested in the organization, is the only way that we can really do that with any level of precision beyond high level insights in the business. And for a lot of firms, the fact that they're leaving money on the table, struggling with profitability, is often related to a lack of visibility into those things. So that's the short version on why I think it's important, and a really great tool when used properly for everybody in the organization, not just the leadership team.
Yeah. I've heard us liken, all of this to a restaurant, in that restaurants not tracking their food costs is kind of the equivalent here. So can't really price its meals. Restaurants can't price or measure profitability without knowing how much the ingredients cost, for example, just like agencies can't price their services or understand profitability, much the same.
And so this is like, there's a common, there are some well-known thought leaders in the space that when asked about time tracking will say, you should never do it unless unless you're struggling with profitability, or there's a lot of things changing, or you're not sure about the scope of what's going into projects and so on. And so that sort of is actually aligned in many ways to my perspective, which is you should have a model of where time is going. And so if you know that your assumptions about where timing is going are accurate, and I would argue that the only way to really verify that is to measure it in some way, right? Or at least at some increment throughout the year, to know that, like, okay, there isn't a massive difference between what we think is going to go into this project when we sold it and then what actually goes into it. Then you have effectively what you need to do all of the analysis, right? If you can have a resource plan, or you can have a scope of work that, like, that's actually what's going to happen, then great. You know how much time got invested into something. And if you have a lot of uncertainty around that, or if things are changing a lot, then you probably need a little bit of a more precise way to get that feedback loop and get that information. And then the thing that I'll usually say on top of this is, raise your hand if, as an agency owner or part of an agency team, you feel like you currently have a ton of certainty about what's going on. There's nothing changing in the business, and you feel very, very good about the assumptions that get made before projects start about how much time is going to be invested. And you're really, really certain that there's not major deviations from that occurring in the business. And no one's going to raise their hand. That's just like not the case for 98% of agencies. And so I would say that for most people, the conditions under which it would be okay to not have some way of tracking time are just not actually feasible most of the time.
So if the problem with timesheets isn't relevancy, we know we need this data, why do you think timesheets get such a bad rap?
Because they're really inconvenient, I think, for a lot of people. I'm going to separate this into two major categories. The thing that a lot of people talk about initially is the tactical reasons that it's crappy. I got to log into the timesheet software. I got to put in the time. It's extra stuff that I'm doing. It's not, I'd rather be working on other things. The time tracking thing is cumbersome. And there's a lot of things that agencies are doing that are making it harder on their team than it should be. They're making the system too complicated. They're trying to get too precise in how they're measuring things. They're not leveraging technologies that are now available to remove a lot of the friction. But that's actually, I don't think that's really the problem. I think that your team could tolerate a lot of friction at a tactical level if the more common issues, which I think are more strategic and cultural, were addressed. And so I think the real reasons that people dislike time tracking is because they often don't understand why it's being done. And the reason they don't understand why it's being done is because they're not involved in the conversations and decisions that are happening around that data. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. If the team believes that time tracking data is being used to measure how hard they're working, that's not going to be good, no matter what. That's also not what it should be used for. If the time tracking data is used to hold people accountable to utilization targets, that's not going to be good. That's also not what it should be used for. If the time tracking data is used to have punitive conversations with people that have to spend more time than what was budgeted to complete a project and to do right by the client, that's not going to be good. I would also argue that's not what it should be used for. And the problem is, most of the time, employees are told you must put your time into this system, and then that's it. They have no visibility into how that data is being used, what discussions are happening, what decisions are being made around it, and they can't connect the dots and see and feel and touch and be involved in the ways in which it benefits and protects them. That, to me, is the most fundamental issue. And it's a problem for two reasons. Management teams often don't know how to use that time in the right way, and therefore are also not involving their team and closing the loop and creating this sort of good culture around it. And then that manifests itself in all kinds of other ways that start to feel tactical. That's my take on this.
Yeah. And so when utilization is exposed, for example, to someone who's putting a timesheet or managing a timesheet, what are some of the effects that can have on data that's being recorded? So what are the negative consequences there?
Yeah, we'll talk about utilization, but I could talk about sort of there's really two sides of the spectrum, and this is why it's important to have a really balanced conversation around this time management. But let's say, for example, utilization is the only metric that's being exposed and people are being held accountable to it. Well, what's going to occur there is you have to think about the incentives. I think it's Charlie Munger that said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So in this case, the incentive is I must log as many billable hours as possible, regardless of how much time is actually available for me to create value. And so what you tend to have happen there is everyone all of a sudden is magically very busy, no matter how much client work there is to do, no matter how much there is in the sales pipeline. When you have a lot of client work to do, things are closer to being on time and on budget. When you don't have a lot of client work to do, all of a sudden, magically, it takes twice as long to get the same thing done. And whether that's actually the reality or not, what you'll find is that the team will be incentivized to either spend more time than they need to on things to inflate their utilization or lie on their timesheets to inflate their utilization, especially if there is any kind of financial incentive, cultural incentive, or punitive conversation tied to utilization. The flip side of that is if the only thing you ever talk about is hours versus plan, or basically estimated versus actual hours, then what you'll find is projects will magically always be on budget, even when you know that somebody worked through the weekend, and they will start to hide the amount of time that it actually takes to get things done. And then you'll have like this false sense of how busy the team actually is, how profitable your projects actually are. You won't have a solid feedback loop into scoping and pricing. And so you can't really be fully lopsided towards one or the other. It takes balance and it takes mindfulness. And this is not necessarily an easy thing to do. Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Yeah. No, what I'm hearing though is if the balance is incorrect, really what you've got is data that you can't really trust anyway, even if someone is complying with your request to enter it.
And this gets into methodologies, which I know we'll talk about later in the episode, but like maybe the answer is you don't get the team to tell you how much time they spent. You come up with other ways of developing that model that are actually more accurate despite being less precise.
Well, let's actually get into some of the misconceptions and alternatives, right? So one of the misconceptions around time tracking, we touched on this just a little while ago, is that it's only relevant for agencies using time and materials. So why is it relevant for all pricing strategies, not just time and materials?
The simple answer is that the cost basis in a service-based business, by definition, is largely driven by how much time goes into getting something done, right? So this is especially true of firms where the majority of the work, or really any of the work, is being done by people who are not the owners or founders of the company. Where, you could argue that in that other case, there's a theoretical value to their time that should be computed, and I would agree with that. But let's imagine that that's not important. Then certainly when there is objectively a cost to how much time someone is investing, then that should be measured. So the simple example of this is, let's say, for example, I sell a $10,000 project. And I have a team of people, and based on the salaries that I pay them and how much capacity I buy from them for that salary, the average cost of an hour of their time is $50, right? And so if they spend 100 hours on that project, they will have spent $5,000 to get that project done. Therefore, there will be a 50% profit margin on that thing, which we can then use to pay for overhead and hopefully have a profit left over. If they spend twice as many hours, we will have spent $10,000 to get that project done. And I think there's a lot of people that think like, oh, well, that doesn't really matter, right? The goal is just to have enough revenue coming in to cover the salaries and then more than that. But the problem is, like, if every time you start to sell as much work as is required to cover your operating expenses, your team can't take on more work and you have to hire more people, then like your business model is failing. So it always, whether you like it or not, it comes back to this equation of how much time is required, what is the cost of that time, how does that compare to what you sell? And the only way to really figure that out at precise levels within the organization, like in terms of clients, projects, services, is to have an understanding of how much time goes into those things. So that's why it's important. No matter how you bill, your cost basis is always tied to time, primarily in this business model.
Let's actually dig into some of the metrics that you're starting to get at here. There are three core ones here that we're talking about. Delivery margin, utilization, and ABR. So let's kind of unpack. What core metrics are impacted? What are they, and why are they impacted specifically?
So the first kind of key metric that we focus on at Parakeeto is, of course, delivery margin, which really looks at, for every dollar of revenue that we collect from clients after we remove money that didn't belong to us in the first place, like media spend and so on. So for every dollar of client revenue that belongs to us, what percentage of that dollar is left over after we've actually incurred the cost of getting the work done? And you don't need time tracking data necessarily to measure this for the entire business. So that's good. I suppose everybody has access to that. But then, of course, the question often becomes, okay, this number is not as high as we want it to be, and we want it to be generally at least 50% for the whole business. And the question becomes why? And there's only three reasons that that number could be lower than you want it to be. It comes down to either the average cost per hour of labor is too high. That's not usually the issue for most of the firms that we deal with. Or the average billable rate of the organization is too low, which means that for every hour of effort that we invest in doing client work, we don't earn enough revenue. So we're either spending too much time or we're not charging enough, or a little bit of both. And then the third reason would be our utilization rate. The percentage of time that we buy from our team that's being used to earn revenue is not high enough. So in other words, we're paying for a bunch of people and a bunch of their time, and there's not enough work to keep them busy enough to generate enough revenue to be able to make that margin work. And there's an infinite combination of those three numbers that can get a firm to the right outcome. But without having an understanding of how much time is being spent, and ideally where it's being spent, then we can't answer the more precise and more important question of why aren't we as profitable as we want to be, and what do we actually need to fix in order to get there? We can't really understand if the things that we're selling are profitable or not, or more or less profitable than we thought. We can't really figure out if the team is as busy as we thought they were going to be or not. We can't really figure out any of those things unless we have time.
This actually gets into the agency profitability flywheel a little bit. And let's talk a little bit about, the data feedback loop that we're establishing with these actual data points that you get through time tracking.
Yeah, so we think about this as being sort of two major steps inside of a 4-step framework. And so the first two steps are related to having a feedback loop in the organization that is quantitative, or, essentially numbers based. And the big idea there is we want to be really good at structuring our assumptions about what's going to happen into the future. So, in practice, what that means is how we scope and price projects. So when we sell something, we have an understanding of how much are we selling it for, how much that money is ours, what do we expect to spend to get it done, how many hours do we think that's going to take, over what time period do we think that's going to happen, right? It's basic stuff, but Not a lot of firms are very deliberate about that and very structured about that. So it's that piece. Then the second piece is capacity, right? What kind of capacity do we have available to us across our team? How much of that time is available for client work? How many hours of client work do we have planned? How much revenue do we have planned? So really get an understanding of, are we expecting to have a good outcome here based on the team that we have, the expenses we have, and the amount of work we have coming in? And then, of course, the last is the profitability outcomes of those things, right? So that's the first thing, is having the plan and the assumptions into the future. Then the second piece is the actuals. So tracking, financials, of course, but also time, so we can understand the difference between our assumptions and reality. So that if we are not as profitable as we expected to be, we know why. And it's one of, essentially 4 things, and only 2 of them are common. We spent too much on overhead, almost never happens. We are paying our people way too much relative to what we can price, almost never happens. Or we weren't as busy as we thought we were going to be, pretty common. Or we weren't as profitable on the work as we thought we were going to be, either because we didn't charge enough or we spent too much time, or both. Those are the 2 most common things. And so having that first feedback loop, the quantitative feedback loop, is critically important, because really what that's meant to do is create alignment. Because if we can look at quantitative data and see we were not as profitable as we could have been, specifically because this metric was lower than we expected it to be, now as a team, we can get straight to the important thing, which is, what can we learn from that and what do we do about it? And that sort of gets into the second part of the flywheel, which is reports and meetings, where we sit down as a team, we look at this stuff, we develop a shared understanding and alignment. And then the fourth piece of this is process improvements or changes, where as a team, we then ideate on, what do we do about this? We install that change, and then the whole thing repeats itself. And over time, this should get tighter. And ideally, the gaps between our assumptions and reality get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's really the big idea behind the profitability flywheel, is quantitative feedback, which feeds into a qualitative feedback loop, which is like discussing and making decisions on the data.
Yeah, and I think that entire flywheel, coupled with really explaining to your team up front, what the purpose of time tracking is it's just, those 2 things are essential to getting that buy-in that we're trying to create here around the entirety of, collecting the data, improving because of it, and again, just team understanding and participation.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important piece, because the alignment is so key. And I think that it's underestimated how important the alignment piece of this is, and therefore the work that happens before you start tracking all of this stuff. And it's stuff that seems obvious, but if you're listening to this, you've probably had this experience where it's like, we run straight to tracking all these metrics. Then we realize 6 months later that we never agreed how to actually calculate that metric in a very precise way. So now 7 people in the organization have a different definition for utilization, because we can't agree on what capacity is, and we can't agree on what a billable hour is. And now this is just a crapshoot, and we're wasting time, and we're arguing with each other, and we're having misalignments, and we're not getting anything done. And the whole purpose of this is not getting fulfilled. And there's bad blood, and everyone's like, this is a waste of time. Why are we even tracking our time? We end up with all of like the negative incentives that we talked about earlier, because we're not on the same page about how we're supposed to use this information and what it means, right? So like, it is so important to start by aligning on a framework, getting really clear on what the purpose is, getting really clear on what questions we're trying to answer, and installing the quantitative feedback loop in such a way that it serves those things. And if we do that well, the benefit is immense, because we move away from these subjective discussions that waste so much time, right? Of people saying, well, I think that we're not profitable because this, that, and the other thing. That is such an unproductive conversation. There should be no I think discussion about this. It's math. And that math is available to us. And the quicker we can just get to, okay, we all agree that this is the problem. Now let's work together to come up with ways that we can solve it. That is where you actually have rubber meet the road. And that's the point of all of this, right? Like the data is only as valuable as the change that it enacts.
So I want to make sure we cover off on one more thing that we mentioned earlier in the episode, and this is around some optionality, or alternatives to time tracking using timesheets. So let's kind of explore a couple of those options there, just for people who think, maybe timesheets aren't exactly the way to go. What other options do we have?
Yeah, so there's sort of a spectrum that exists with this. Timesheets being sort of all the way to one end, which is individual contributors on the team are asked to, on a regular cadence, go in and indicate where they spent their time exactly. So that's sort of on one extreme. And typically you're sort of forced into that when your business model is such that there is a very wide spread of things that your team is doing at any given moment, and they're jumping around between those things on a daily basis. The more complexity there is at the individual level in terms of where time is going, and the more erratic that is, the more you're probably going to need to go in that direction and just have people fill out timesheets, sort of in the traditional way. And then as you start to move to the other side of the spectrum, the other extreme is you can generally plan for how much time someone's going to spend on something in a given day, in a given week, in a given month. And that's a fairly reliable thing. And there might be some changes to it, but a project manager that's managing a team of people can usually do a pretty good job of just keeping a resource plan up to date. And in that instance, if you export a resource plan to a CSV, guess what it looks like? It looks like a timesheet. Person, project, date, time, same metadata, right? And so that is a equally valid way to track time. It's not as precise generally, but in the event where you are assigning people to entire projects for a week at a time for their full capacity, or even just like on like a day at a time at their full capacity, that's probably pretty feasible to centralize time tracking within a resource planning or a staff planning sort of function. And then you have sort of everything in between that. So a little step behind that would be resource planned informed time tracking, where a person still has to go in and check their timesheets and fill them out. But the resource plan, in terms of what they were assigned to, is already pre-filled in there as the baseline. So they're still making changes to what actually happened, but a lot of the work is already done for them. A step back from that would be sort of behavior influenced time tracking. And so there's lots of great tools now, like MemTime, for example, that will track what you're doing on your computer, what apps are open, what emails you're sending, what meetings you're in, looking at your calendar, and help you come up with, hey, here's how much time you spent, on your different clients, and do a lot of the heavy lifting to fill in your timesheets. Again, you still have to sort of verify that, but it's doing that work for you. And a lot of these tools like MemTime, for example, don't share that information with your employer. It's just for you. It's just there to help you. These technologies can be combined together. So there are a lot of in-betweens now that are not just what people traditionally think of as timesheets. And depending on what your day-to-day looks like and how your team gets resourced against things, you could move entirely away from time tracking in the traditional way and still have the data that you need to make good decisions and protect your team from being overworked.
And I think importantly, this is the reason why Parakeeto really is tool agnostic and kind of approach agnostic as well. We've definitely worked with clients who've used the resource planning option, things like that. So all of the above, good bits. All right, so we've built a case for time tracking, but I think we may have some listeners out there, particularly ops folks, who might be trying to think through just how exactly to implement this, right? How to serve it up to the team the right way. So what tips can we kind of share here for these guys?
Well, I think I'll start by just talking a little bit about our process. There's a reason we do that last. So when we work with clients, our 3 steps is we start with an assessment, which is really about understanding the business model. Then we focus on forecasting. And then the last piece is we install time tracking. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And I think that this sequencing is probably just a best practice for anybody to adopt when they're trying to go down this path. So the reason we do this is time tracking tends to be the most expensive and difficult part to get buy-in on. And if you just do that without doing the first 2 steps, you're still not going to get the outcome that you're looking for, right? And so the big idea here is that insight is a function of actual performance relative to expected performance. And I've seen so many firms go down this path where they spend 6 months, getting a time tracking tool, bringing it into the organization, training everybody, hammering them on compliance. They finally start getting data, and then they're like, wait a second, I don't know what this means, right? Our utilization is X. Great. Is that good or is it bad, right? They never thought to solve for the other side of the equation. And I think the important thing to remember is the other side of the equation is way easier to solve for. It doesn't require you to get any net new information. It only requires you to structure the information you already have. So the step 1 in that is build a model of your agency and understand what you expect these metrics to look like, right? And we have a whole bunch of tools for that. Check out the toolkit there's even a free trial in there for a software that like helps you do this exact process. But list out your team, how much they get paid, how many hours you expect them to work, how much time off they get, what you bill for things, what you expect to spend on overhead. And then you should be able to get an understanding of, okay, this is like what our utilization should look like. This is what our average billable rate should look like. This is what our delivery margin should look like. This is what our net profit should look like. Now you have a baseline, right? And so that would be step one. And then what you can do with that is compare your current performance to it, and then go to your leadership team and say, hey guys, look at all this money we're leaving on the table. And it's specifically because of these numbers, right? And if you don't feel comfortable doing that yourself, then you could pay us to do it for you. That's a service that we offer. By the way, shameless plug. Step two, right? Now we know where the gaps are. Step two is the forecasting piece, right? Because again, if you jump forward to time tracking, you get the measurement back. Then the question is, well, are we here because we executed poorly, or are we here because we actually planned to be here? We just didn't know it. So step two, once you have the model, is forecasting. How much work is coming in? What does our hiring or firing plan look like? Right? And are we even on track to hit any of these numbers? And you can learn a lot from those first two steps that don't require any time tracking. You could learn that we're not profitable, not because we're just not even planning to be profitable. So you could fix that with no time tracking at all. And it's only once you are at a place where it's like, we know what the objectives are. We are theoretically planning to hit those objectives, and yet we're still not getting there. Then it's very important to say, okay, we need to get time tracking in place because there's a gap between our expectations and reality that we need to clarify. So if you do those first two steps, you should have way more buy-in, because it'll be clear like what the question is that you're trying to answer. And you'll have done the hardest work that should precede installing time tracking, which is really getting clear on how those assumptions are structured, right? Because you can't really figure out the proper way to instrument time tracking unless you know what it's being compared to and how that's structured. And I think this backward sequencing is one of the biggest traps that clients that come to us after having tried to do this themselves have fallen into, where they sort of started with time tracking and then tried to back into everything else. And it's both the most expensive and least efficient way to get to this outcome. You really should come at it from the other side. So for anyone listening, that is what I would encourage you to do in terms of sequencing. The best way to get to time tracking is to start by not focusing on time tracking and focus on the first two things that come before it.
Everyone should feel great about that conclusion, actually. So you mentioned the toolkit. Let's actually wrap things up here for folks and guide them to the resources that I think would help them get started with this process here.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, check the show notes. There's always a link to the Agency Profit Toolkit. And specifically what you're going to find in there that I think will be helpful is, number one, a set of videos that sort of walk you through in more detail the flywheel that we talked about on today's episode, and then some of the metrics that we touched on in today's episode in terms of the financial and non-financial metrics that time tracking can help you calculate. It goes into all kinds of detail about how to track them, what the formulas are, how we define them, right? Examples of reports that you could run. And then it will actually give you access to a free trial for a platform that you can use to do the first step I talked about today, which is build a model of your agency and get an understanding of what your business looks like if you looked at it through our lens, the way that we look at every agency through, how you compare the benchmarks, and maybe you can even do the napkin math to figure out how you compare to your current performance. So those are I think some of the things that are going to be really helpful inside of the toolkit, and you basically will get walked through those in that order. So if this is like a burning problem for you, or it's something that you've been tasked to deal with as the ops or finance lead in the business, but isn't necessarily something you've done before, then that's why we created that resource. And I think, Kristen, perhaps you could speak to how helpful it is when you've been thrust into that position.
Yeah. In that position, you're really just looking for a place to start. What is the first step that I can take to make sure that I'm setting this up with integrity, setting this up to succeed, right? And so I think that toolkit really is a great baseline, especially just to wrap your head around the metrics and the process and the sequencing that Marcel just walked through. Really invaluable. So definitely check that one out. TLDR, timesheets don't have to suck. There can be insightful and built with purpose. So
I'll close on saying that it's very possible that they still will suck, in the same way that brushing your teeth sucks, or in the same way that going to the gym sucks. But I think what is most important is people can still see it as being healthy. And then the tolerance for how sucky they are goes up significantly. All right. Well, Kristen, I got to say, I really enjoyed this conversation. It's something that I could talk about ad nauseum. And we obviously spent a lot of time talking about with our clients. So I appreciate you guiding us through this. And I hope it was helpful to those listening that maybe are in the trenches right now, trying to get this installed or trying to revamp time tracking, or really just trying to understand what their relationship with it is. Hopefully this provides some clarity. And of course, if you have questions, we always love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment wherever you're listening to this, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.